Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and this is a super interesting and important conversation, so I'm glad to participate. As with the others, what I'll do is really focus on a few things that strike me. There isn't a simple answer on this set of questions. There are problems of political culture and political structure, as we've just heard. I want to add a little bit to the characterization of each of those before saying something specifically about some avenues for forward movement with regard to education policy that I see at least. So with regard to the point just made about ideology and party identification, I think one has to add another layer to that and expand one's sense of what ideology means. So ideology is not merely a set of political beliefs, how one thinks about government, for example, the role of government in our lives, or how one thinks about an ideal of liberty, or how one thinks about guns. There's also deeper issues of cultural division in the country. Religion is central to that, so there's a strong divide in terms of religious affiliation and engagement between the two parties at this point also. So the ID questions, the identity questions, really extend across ideology to party ID to culture. And it's not only that we see this as observers of the political system. I actually just before this came from a meeting with the U.S. Marine Corps command that's in charge of recruitment into the Marine Corps, and they're also wrestling with the question of polarization. And for them, the difficulty is that they find it very easy to recruit from among white Southern conservatives, and very hard to recruit from among Northeastern liberals. And again, easy to recruit from among religious Americans, not easy to recruit from among Americans who aren't religious. So the point really is that across the urban-rural divide and across something that is also a racial divide, we have a quite deep cultural divide at this particular moment in time, deeper than it has been for a while, and it does line up with party identification and political ideology. But as I see it, the core way in which this is expressing itself as a set of political choices is actually in a revival of what I would call a moment of states' rights politics. So I think that that is how we should understand our current political moment, that the fight is once again over states' rights, and that a lot of the ideological work being done by the Tea Party and therefore also by the Republican Party as it's been pulled by them is precisely in that direction, trying to push back the authority of the federal government. We're, of course, familiar with that with regard to the health care reform conversation. But it's also the core idea that manifests itself in the bill that came out of the Senate Help Committee on the ESEA reauthorization, the Every Child Achieves Act. So the most important thing that happened, as you know, in my reading of those materials, is the language that prohibits the Department of Education from mandating or incentivizing the use of standards across the different states. In other words, even the use of sort of the nudging power of federal bureaucracy has been reined in the language of this act. And so that, in that regard, its fundamental purpose is to restore power to the states, power to local control. And I think that's the shape of the battle that we're seeing across a lot of policy domains. Again, it's a sort of states' rights question. So what does that mean for education policy specifically? I think on the one hand that we do need to do, as was just suggested, sort of put pressure on the party system at the national level. We also need to work on the question of political culture. How do we restore sort of positive understanding of the value of government for pursuing collective goods and the common good? But at the same time that we might pursue those projects of, on the one hand, structure and institutional reform and cultural reform, I think there is actually work to be done at the state level that we should focus on. So I think, in other words, to some extent, I think it's reasonable to accept the shift of the location of action from the federal to the state level and think about what the right strategies and tactics are for advancing educational reform under that framework. And in saying this, I draw specifically on the work of litigators. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Michael Rebell, who spearheaded the Campaign for Fiscal Equity in New York. But he's a lawyer who has been at the forefront of a shift in litigation strategy from the federal courts to state courts, right? Because the federal courts were closed down as avenue for educational equity in the 1970s. But as litigators tried to respond to that, moving to the state courts, they began by trying to evoke the Equal Protection Clause in state courts to argue for more equitable distributions of funding for education at the state level. But as they did this, what they came to realize was that while there's no protection for education in the federal constitution, in fact, most state constitutions do have a right to education built into them. So the language of state constitutions tends to be things like, in New Jersey, a right to a sound basic education; in Washington, a right to a thorough and efficient education; in Florida, to a high-quality education; an ample education is another phrase. But nearly all states have a constitutional right to education. Then there's the question of, well, what does this right mean at the state level? And there are really two components to the definition that litigators have worked out by looking back into the legislative history at the state level. There is, as you would expect to find, a component that is about economic success for students, that they require an education adequate to equipping them to compete economically. But there's also a lot of language about the education of young people for citizenship. And in fact, it's the idea that the right to education is meant to equip people to be effective civic actors that's the leading argument in the legislative history around the production of these rights. So in other words, at the state level, every young person has a constitutional right to an education adequate to equip them not only as somebody to compete in the economy, but also as a citizen. So the question is then, what resources does that constitutional right at the state level provide for educational reform? Michael Rebell, when he talks about litigation and the litigation work, points to the fact that judges have worked hard to understand this right, but find that they're not getting enough support in terms of their effort to answer the question of what would count as a sound basic education or an adequate education. So they could use more research that actually gives them a basis for their rulings for identifying whether their state is doing the job it should be doing or not. This seems to me a place where one could actually return to Common Core conversations and use the language of the Common Core standards, the material developed there, to help judges answer the question of whether or not their states are living up to the requirement to provide a sound basic education. There's more work needs to be done to help states flesh out their understanding of what their standards need to be. In addition, one can also help judges understand better the particular kinds of requirements that they can put on school districts. So, for example, Rebell suggests that litigators can ask courts to require states and school districts to delineate even the range of content knowledge in civics, for example, that students might need. That courts could require schools to identify the extracurricular activities and range of surrounding supports that are necessary to achieve a sound basic education. In other words, courts can help to do the standard setting work that a lot of us are talking about. But the point, too, is that those resources of the state level constitutional law and the litigation strategy need to be coupled with politics at the state level to change specific state cultures in the direction of supporting educational reform that would work in the best interests of students. The last thing I want to say there about this focus on the state level strategy and trying to take advantage of what the state constitutions offer is that there's a lot to say about the kind of education that you need to empower young people as citizens. There is not a lot, but a little research coming out of political science, particularly a researcher named Sunshine Hilligus, that really underscores the relationship between English language arts and civic efficacy. And I think the English language arts part of the curriculum is one that is much harder to defend typically in the policy arena. We focus so much on STEM. Yet there is a correlation between civic participation and efficacy and English language arts. And so the language in the state constitutions and the focus in those constitutions on civic education also provides a resource for defending the English language arts within the curriculum and making sure that the time in the school day permits coverage across that domain of social studies in addition to the STEM areas and math areas. The last thing I want to say there on that point closes the loop on the title of this panel. We were invited to talk about polarization, educational policy, and economic policy. And so far we haven't really talked at all about economic policy. And the reason I'm coming to it now only at the end, having focused mostly on education policy, is because my own assessment of the state of economic policy is that achieving more progressive outcomes on that front, in fact, requires a broader more voter participation, a broader electorate, and an electorate that's empowered across class divisions. So if you look at levels of participation, they closely track educational levels. And the most important civic participation gap we have is really between people with a high school education and people with a college education. So a focus on civic education, supported by a strategy based on state constitutions, ought to empower a citizenry, including those whose education ends at high school, more effectively to act in the public sphere. And in the ideal world of the political philosopher that I am, that sort of empowered citizenry would be an important component of rebuilding a foundation for more success at achieving progressive economic policy outcomes. Thanks.